It's the start of the year 1940. The phony war is in full swing. The border between France and Germany is all quiet, while Red Army and Wehrmacht troops hold joint parades celebrating their victory over Poland. Yet even as Europe sits dormant, with air forces doing nothing but dropping propaganda leaflets, the war at sea is raging. And on this lazy winter evening, a tense standoff is taking place in the cold dark waters of Scandinavia. This part of World War II's history is largely forgotten in modern popular histories, so much so that the latest and greatest Netflix documentary about World War II edited this chapter out entirely. It appears nowhere in the entire documentary. Yet the effect it had on the war is absolutely massive, all while being a story unlike any other, with some of the most incredible feats of martial skill and heroism. Feats so insane you would dismiss them as Hollywood fantasy had they not been witnessed and recorded for posterity. So today, I will set about fixing this glaring oversight and tell you the long but exciting story of the German invasion of Norway. Get some refreshments, get comfortable, and prepare for a tale like no other, because I promise you, it's a story worth hearing. How worth hearing, you might ask? Well, we're gonna need this. This video has kindly been sponsored by the world's fastest and most popular VPN service provider, NordVPN. In today's ever-changing technology landscape, a VPN is vital for staying safe online. We all know what a VPN is by now, and let's be honest, most of us have one. We use it to get around region blockers and access our favourite content, which, as an anime fan, I definitely need. We use it to keep our data safe from hackers, we use it to secure our IP, and you can be sure that Nord does everything a great VPN should do, and it does it brilliantly. But what you might not know is that it does much more than that. Nord's active protection shields you from malware, trackers, and ads. The inbuilt dark web monitor notifies you if someone steals your credentials. MeshNet allows you to connect up to 6 devices remotely and securely, and it comes with a dedicated IP that helps you avoid captchas and block lists. In my job here at YouTube, I have to go to corners of the internet a normal person really shouldn't be going to, so Nord's security features are vital for me, and they are vital for you. But the best part is, they don't track your information or share it, and are fully encrypted at all times, with an emergency kill switch should things get out of control. They have 24/7 customer support, a dedicated app for every device, and right now, you can get 4 months extra on a 2-year plan by just clicking the link in the description below. They have a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you literally have nothing to lose by giving them a try. So please do give them a try. Click the link in the description and get that special offer. Plus, you'll help the channel, and I appreciate all the help I can get. Now, back to the video. As the sun sat low on the horizon that February evening, an international incident of crisis-like proportions was starting to take shape. HMS Cossack of His Majesty's Royal Navy was staring down the fully armed launches of 2 Norwegian torpedo boats, the Skarv and the Kagel. The cause of this confrontation being the British violation of their neutrality and their territorial waters to chase down a German freighter named the Altmark, who was even then trying to slink away from the scene. It's worth noting that the prelude to this incident is just as convoluted as the incident itself. Altmark had been a freighter supporting the pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee in the South Atlantic, which had been achieving great success in sinking Allied merchant traffic. The issue was, at this point in the war, both sides were still trying to play the public opinion card on the world stage, as the mass murders, carpet bombings, and brutal sieges hadn't happened yet, meaning all the conventions and rules agreed upon prior to the war were being scrupulously followed, including cruiser rules and prize rules. Any ship engaged in neutral or international waters had to be searched before engaging, and any ship sunk according to the laws of war must have its crew rescued. As such, Altmark, having completed its resupply of Graf Spee, was ordered to collect the British POWs from the sunken vessels and transport them to Germany for internment, taking an extreme northern route around Scotland and into Norwegian waters to avoid getting caught by the Royal Navy, who were then in pursuit of Graf Spee, or the Royal Air Force's coastal command patrols. The irony of all this was that they had actually managed their escape because the British had already found Graf Spee and were focusing their efforts on destroying her rather than her support units nearby, which they achieved by tricking the Graf Spee's captain into sinking his own ship by trapping him in the mouth of the River Plate and then broadcasting on open channels that a whole armada was coming in to destroy them with aircraft carriers and everything, even though Force H from Gibraltar was 3,000 miles away, and they could have easily fought their way out before they showed up. But the captain of Graf Spee didn't know that, and so yep, the Royal Navy tricked the Germans into sinking their own battlecruiser. Fast forwarding back to the present, after all of this drama, the Altmark, carrying the prisoners of the ships Graf Spee had sunk, has now been spotted and subsequently cornered by HMS Cossack, who, thanks to British intelligence, knows the ship's cargo. Needless to say, they wanted their sailors back. Now, the Norwegians had searched the vessel several times over its transit through their waters, and they hadn't found anything, so they had begun escorting it towards German-controlled waters to maintain their neutrality. But in keeping with his now famous persona, the First Lord of the Admiralty, one Winston Spencer Churchill, had other ideas. There had been a consistent fracas among the Allied High Command about German sea trade in Scandinavia and the Baltic. It was very clear that their Nordic commerce was vital to their war effort, yet no one could really agree on what to do about it. Churchill, of course, advocated for the most extreme actions possible in taking the fight to Hitler, but naturally his reputation for adventurism after Gallipoli didn't lend much strength to his argument. It was then Altmark came to his rescue. The Kriegsmarine transporting prisoners of war through Norwegian territorial waters was a violation of their neutrality, at least in the eyes of the British Admiralty, which gave Churchill an opening. He ordered HMS Cossack to mount a rescue mission, preferably with the cooperation of the Norwegian Navy. However, crucially, it wasn't a requirement. He just asked the ship's commanders to make sure they don't shoot at them. HMS Cossack then signalled to the Norwegians and Altmark that they would initiate a boarding action unless the Norwegians joined them in escorting the Altmark to Bergen, where they would organise the retrieval of their sailors. The Norwegians immediately protested this, of course, as this would violate their neutrality and appear as an act of collusion with the Allies, which was likely to enrage the Germans. But at the same time, they also made the sound judgment that firing at the most powerful navy in the world was, on balance, not an intelligent course of action, and thus, the Norwegians withdrew from the area. With their primary diplomatic obstacle gone, HMS Cossack pulled up alongside the Altmark, its crew brandishing all manner of battle implements, including bayonets, heavy tools from engineering, and, if rumours are to be believed, a ceremonial cutlass kept aboard for special occasions. And at 22:20 hours, the Royal Navy's saltiest seamen in the finest traditions of their service stormed aboard the German vessel, cutting down 8 of the crew and wounding 10 more in a quick but violent assault, gaining control of the ship within minutes. They immediately began searching the various holds and compartments until they got to the main storage area, where one of the boarders yelled out, "Any Englishmen here?" To which a loud yell came back, "Yes, we're all British!" promptly followed by a line which was used in propaganda throughout the whole war. "Well, chaps, the Navy's here." A line greeted with rapturous cheers from the newly liberated sailors. Yet while a tremendous coup in military terms, diplomatically, it was an absolute disaster. Even Norway's pro-Allies government couldn't sanction such a blatant violation of their neutrality, which resulted in the lodging of a formal complaint to His Majesty King George, as foreign press organisations around the world criticised Britain for this rash and violent action. Yet despite the ferocious uproar of public opinion, and the disastrous diplomatic implications of such an event, which quickly began manifesting themselves, as the rigmarole of public theatre played out on the world stage, no one had any idea the scale of the crisis they had just set into motion. Adolf Hitler was a very angry man. And I mean more angry than usual, which is an achievement in of itself. An absolute typhoon of phone calls had rung out from the Reichschancellery, summoning the department heads of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, responsible for planning operations in Scandinavia. Hitler had previously met with the head of Norway's fascist movement, Vidkun Quisling, on December 14th, who was then advocating for a coup d'etat supported by a division of German troops. Indeed, Quisling would soon become a slang term among the British public for collaborators and traitors in the aftermath of the upcoming invasion. Hitler had agreed with Quisling on principle that having a friendly government in Norway would be beneficial to Germany's national security, particularly regarding naval operations, as well as offering full protection to their maritime trade in the Baltic and the North Sea. However, Norwegian neutrality was also very useful, in the sense that as long as there was a third party able to play the victim internationally, the Allies couldn't move in without incurring a grievous diplomatic and political cost, which after the invasions of Poland and Czechoslovakia would go a long way to advancing the Nazis' position internationally. As we've seen with current events in our own time, pushing a both sides debate is an effective method of undermining support from powerful neutral nations, who may or may not sympathise with the enemy. Turning the US public on Britain is not particularly difficult to do. After all, Hitler had already won over Charles Lindbergh and Henry Ford. In fact, he even gave them medals. Of course, this was due to their views on race and their much publicised anti-Semitism. The United States was not exactly progressive on racial issues at the time, and they definitely didn't have a lot of time for the English. Thus, the American public were quite happy to stay out of European entanglements, as their founding father would call it. But even with all these facts in mind, to turn public opinion against Britain and the Allied cause enough that the elected officials would be forced to abandon their support for the Allies entirely and double down on neutrality was quite another thing. The Nazis were engaged in a blatant war of aggression, and France was a traditional American ally. Not to mention rearmament was providing jobs for the United States as early as the mid-30s, getting them out of the Depression. However, if the Allies were then to suddenly themselves invade neutral nations and make war, that would certainly change up the dynamic as well as bring back the both sides discussion into the equation. But in the aftermath of the Altmark incident, as it was now being called, despite their protestations to the contrary, Hitler was convinced that the Norwegians were no longer willing to enforce their neutrality, and that their sympathies laid with the Allies. As such, there was every chance that they may join the war and pose an unacceptable threat to Germany's northern flank. This was a risk they simply couldn't take, and so Case Nord, as it had been called, was ordered to be expanded and, more importantly, expedited. Both Denmark and Norway would need to be invaded and occupied by a task force involving what amounted to the entirety of the Kriegsmarine, combined with a small but elite force of Germany's best infantry units. The plan for the operation was relatively simple, and in fact there was a good reason for its simplicity. General von Falkenhorst was the man assigned to lead the operation. He was given this assignment because he was the only senior German officer with Arctic warfare experience he had gotten fighting the Soviet Union as part of a German expedition to support Finnish independence. Hitler had called von Falkenhorst into the Reichschancellery, appointed him commander, and then told him to formulate a basic plan for the Führer's consideration by 5 PM that evening. Imagine that for a second. Your boss calls you into work early, only to ask you to organise the invasion of two sovereign nations by close of business. It was so short notice, in fact, that Falkenhorst actually planned the entire invasion of Norway and Denmark with a tourist guidebook from the late 1920s. The invasion was to be spearheaded by the paratroopers of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Regiment, along with both the 2nd and 3rd Mountain Divisions, the Gebirgsjägers. They were then to be followed by no less than 6 regular infantry divisions to be either airlifted into the captured Norwegian airfields at Kjevik, Sola Stavanger and Oslo Fornebu, or disembarked in the major port cities of Oslo, Bergen, Kristiansand and Narvik. Crucially, however, these units were to be carried by warships instead of transports, including the 2 new battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, allowing them to sail much faster than regular shipping, minimizing their exposure to discovery and attack by the Royal Navy, while also giving them a fighting chance should they be intercepted. This rapid deployment relied primarily on surprise. Once their landing zones were secured, the invasion force was to move on critical government buildings and logistics hubs. With the Norwegian state paralysed, their rail net seized, and their ports closed, the Wehrmacht could rapidly overwhelm Norway's relatively tiny military before they could get the opportunity to mobilise their National Guard units or their reserves. All of this would be backed up by Fliegerkorps 10 of the Luftwaffe, primarily equipped with Bf-110 Zerstörers, twin-engined fighters, heavily armed, and capable of long-range missions. This of course came along with the standard contingent of medium bombers, HE-111s and Dornier 17s. Air support for Operation Weserübung, as the new expanded plan was named, would be limited to just these units, as the Norwegian fighter force was comprised of just 1 squadron, while Denmark was practically defenceless. Not to mention the extended range of the operations due to being launched from Germany, as the Bf-109s just didn't have the fuel. With the basic outline established, the OKW began refining the details of the plan until a date could be chosen, which Hitler set as April 9th, 1940. Thus, the clock began ticking down until the day Norway would meet its fate. But there would be a final, ironic twist. Because unbeknownst to either side, it was now a race to see who would be that fate's master. Meanwhile, back in London, for one of the very few times in his life, Adolf Hitler's rash and paranoid geopolitical ramblings were actually 100% correct. It turns out, while the Germans and Norwegians were collectively fuming, both the British and French high commands were locked in a ferocious debate with one another over how to best take the fight to Germany, and an operation in Scandinavia was foremost on their minds. After the Altmark incident, Churchill had intensified his campaign for a direct intervention in Scandinavia, not just in Norway, but across the whole region. Just as they had in World War I, the Royal Navy immediately moved to blockade Germany from all international trade, and they had done so most effectively. In fact, it was far easier this time, as there was no longer a giant high seas fleet to worry about. The problem was the progress made both in submarines and air power. While they could stop global shipping, they wouldn't be able to close in on the German coastline without opening themselves up to unacceptable risks of ambush and air attack, meaning domestic shipping from nearby neutral nations would be free to trade with Germany. In this specific case, iron ore from northern Sweden, which was transported via the Baltic Sea lanes far out of the Royal Navy's range. Crucially, however, there was a glaring window of opportunity. During winter, the Baltic's northern ports freeze over, meaning the mining companies need a cheap alternative method of moving their goods, namely transporting the ore by rail to warm water ports on the Norwegian North Sea coast, the biggest one being Narvik. And when you want to make steel in large quantities for, warships, tanks, guns, shells, reinforcing struts for whatever chair Hermann Goering is sitting in, you're gonna need a lot of iron ore. Without it, your ability to arm, equip, and resupply the armed forces would be irrevocably compromised. And given that the Germans had yet to annex the various nations of Europe whose domestic iron production could provide an alternative supply, cutting this trade route would practically shut down the German war economy, which is exactly what Churchill was advocating for. But as per usual, the politics of the Grand Alliance and the unique conditions of the phony war led not to decisive action, but to dithering debate. The British were advocating attacking Germany directly, yet they weren't exactly keen on following the aggressive wishes of their First Lord of the Admiralty. Instead, the British government proposed mining every major German waterway and coastal area by air and sea. While this would not decisively halt German shipping, it would put a severe dent in their war production while respecting the neutrality of nearby nations. The problem was, of course, this would involve mining the rivers and canals throughout the Ruhr region, including the Rhine, an action which would almost certainly sink civilian vessels and kill German citizens, inciting retaliation in kind against the Allies, or rather more accurately, retaliation against the French. As you can imagine, the French weren't exactly too happy about that. Their geopolitical goals were surmounted by one overarching objective: prevent the Germans from setting foot in France at all costs. Whatever method they could use to deflect the Nazis away from France, they pushed for, and they pushed hard, to the extent that they were, ironically, in support of Churchill's more aggressive plans, as that would open up a major second front in Scandinavia and the Baltics, which would draw German troops away from any attack on the French homeland. But what was this aggressive plan? Well, ladies, gentlemen, and variations thereupon, strap yourselves in. There were two operations currently in the final stage of planning over at the Admiralty. First was Operation Wilfred, the extensive mining of Norwegian territorial waters, combined with political pressure on Scandinavian states trading with Germany. Of course, this would violate the neutrality of several nations and cause a massive international incident, but the damage to the German war economy would be extensive. Extensive, but not fatal. Furthermore, the Nazis aren't exactly the most gracious or circumspect people. Churchill rightly surmised that should they take such an aggressive step, it would almost certainly prompt an immediate response. Therefore, it would make sense for the Allied forces to preemptively deploy their own troops to resist an attempted German occupation. They would do this while working on the assumption that the Norwegians wouldn't wage an armed resistance against an Allied intervention. A very brave assumption, given what we'll see later. And so, the Admiralty put together Plan R4, which looked like this. Now I know what you're thinking. That's the German plan. And yes, it is. But if you take the Luftwaffe and the paratroopers out of it, R4 and Weserübung are almost exactly the same. Seize the major cities, secure the ports and airfields, control Narvik while cutting its rail link to Sweden. While their force was half the size of the German invasion in terms of total boots on the ground, roughly 3 divisions worth, they weren't expecting the need to defeat and occupy the Norwegians. And if they managed to dig in on the defensive, it was still a large force, and should the Allies seize the air bases in southern Norway, they could stage their own aircraft, and they would also have the necessary naval and air bases from which they could essentially cut the iron ore trade to Germany entirely. There was even a contingency for French mountain troops to seize the iron mines in northern Sweden directly, violating the sovereignty of not just one neutral nation, but 2. Needless to say, there was a considerable amount of consternation at this plan, but it was also the most aggressive operation they could mount without attacking Germany directly or compromising France's defense. So, the plan was put into motion. The troops were assembled for embarkation. The ships began moving to their assembly ports. High-level briefings were held. It seemed like the Allies were finally, actually going to do something. And then came the order to stand down. Operation cancelled. Everything was called off. The men were disembarked, the ships back to their staging areas. It's still debated today whether the virulence of blue balls among the Allied personnel assigned to Scandinavia was due to either the constant false alarms or the awful Arctic climate. But in the specific case of Plan R4, it was because their political cover had been completely and utterly blown. 4UC. While all this drama had been going on in the North Sea, Joseph Stalin, after signing an alliance of convenience with Nazi Germany, had been given free rein to pursue Soviet territorial claims in the Baltic. This included the annexation of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and eastern Poland. But one particularly sore spot for the Man of Steel was Finland. There were valuable ore mines in the northern regions of the country, starting to notice a theme here, while the Karelian Isthmus north of Leningrad posed a serious threat to the Soviet Union's second largest city should Finland align with Nazi Germany in any future conflict. Which, in fairness, given the relations between the Soviet Union and its neighbours, was well within the realms of possibility. After all, like Romania, Poland, Hungary, and the recently subjugated Baltics, the Finns had no love for the Bolsheviks. It's not like the Russian Empire turned Soviet Empire had been invading, occupying, and persecuting them all for centuries or anything. Thus, the Soviets, in a completely unique, out-of-character, totally unheard-of diplomatic justification that they definitely would never use again, faked a border crisis with artillery, declared pro-Finnish citizens in Karelia an existential threat to national security, loudly proclaimed that the government of Finland are actually an elite cabal of fascists in league with the Nazis, requiring a special military operation to annex Finnish territory as an act of self-defense to protect their national security while rescuing loyal Soviet citizens in the Karelia region. I have honestly never heard this before. Any similarity to other events is purely incidental. And so the Winter War began, generating outrage across Western Europe, which resulted in the bizarre situation of both Germany and the Allies providing military aid to the Finns. German helmets, Russian rifles, British planes, French vehicles, it was a wild war. And the reason I'm bringing up the Winter War is precisely because of this military aid package. In order to launch their operation in Scandinavia, which was set to take place on April 5th, the Allies were going to disguise their large-scale deployments in the region as defending the neutrality of the other nations while securing a dedicated aid corridor to Finland. And on March 13th, 1940, despite the Finns putting up an absolutely heroic resistance, the sheer material superiority of the Soviets forced them to the negotiation table. But the Sisu spirit and their battlefield badassery had achieved the desired result. Stalin desperately wanted to end the war as well. He had lost far more men than he really should have, causing near-fatal damage to an army still reeling from his purges in the 30s. He had to get out of the war, and that's without taking into account the fact that his intelligence services had gotten wind of Plan R4's impending arrival. Thus, a ceasefire was signed on March 13th, titled the Moscow Peace Treaty, preserving Finland's independence while removing the Allies' political and diplomatic cover. So Plan R4 was officially suspended and the troops sent back to their bases. However, by now, the British had begun observing the Kriegsmarine concentrating in Germany's northern ports. Either they were onto the Admiralty's plans or preparing for an invasion of their own. In fact, it was both, but that didn't matter. All that mattered was the Allies were back to square one, but they had gone too far in their preparations to do absolutely nothing at all. And so, the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, got his wish. Operation Wilfred was given the green light. They were going to mine Norway's waters with a naval task force departing Royal Navy anchorage Scapa Flow on April 5th, 1940. It was a truly imposing sight, led by the battle cruiser HMS Renown. But one of the smaller destroyers was lagging behind the formation. They were having issues. HMS Glowworm's crew were having a rough time, since their ship had just come out of dry dock for extensive repairs. They were still just running her in. That same day, Neville Chamberlain made a rousing speech in the House of Commons, stating that the Allies had used the lull in combat to sharpen their defences, eliminate their flaws, and now to go on the offensive, loudly proclaiming that Hitler has missed the bus. He hadn't. At that same moment, German troops were boarding their ships, final briefings were being held, and all the while, the machinations of war turned. The eve of battle had dawned. The Kriegsmarine Task Force assigned to take Narvik departed Germany on the 6th of April, with the rest of the fleet moving on the 7th. As is tradition for the early war, though, RAF recon aircraft and local intelligence reported these movements, but they were treated with skepticism from the Admiralty. After all, they had cancelled their invasion of Norway, so why should the Germans invade? It wasn't until April 8th, when British diplomatic assets in Denmark spotted large movements of German warships passing by the Danish coast, that the realization set in. The Germans were en route to Norway, but by then, it was far too late. The Norwegians wouldn't be able to organise in time, while the Allies were too concerned with their own operations' safety. They assumed that the Germans were after a breakout or seeking battle. After all, they could only see warships, there were no transports or anything, and so naval reinforcements would be dispatched in the form of the Royal Navy's home fleet. And unlike the fictional armada, which bluffed Graf Spee into sinking itself, this one was very, very real. Just look at this order of battle. If the Kriegsmarine got caught by that, they'd stand absolutely no chance. But home fleet would take a couple of days to arrive, definitely not fast enough to stop the landing. Meanwhile, the mine layers and destroyers of Operation Wilfred were still out there, and the few heavy warships Germany did have were now heading straight towards them. One of those warships being the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, the leading vessel of Task Force 2, with the objective of seizing Trondheim. Ahead of them was the rearguard of Task Force 1, heading at full speed to Narvik. However, they had lost visual contact with the rear destroyer Z-11 von Arnim, as the early morning fog that blankets the North Sea this time of year had well and truly set in. They couldn't see anything. It was then that the rhythmic hiss of the hull passing through the ocean was violated by the distant sounds of cannon fire. Loud, sharp reports in a booming echo across the waves, with small flashes glimmering in the hazy distance. Captain Helmuth Hay immediately brought his Zeiss binoculars up to his eyes, but he couldn't see anything. It was then that a frantic transmission came through from the destroyers ahead, breaking strict radio silence orders to do so. They were coming under attack by an exceptionally aggressive British destroyer. The enemy had already scored hits, and they were closing to torpedo range. The German ships, despite being superior to the enemy on paper, were laid down with troops and supplies for capturing Narvik, not for combat operations, and they were trying to disengage desperately, but to no avail. The British destroyer was hot on their trail and out for the kill. Captain Hay needed no encouragement. He was in one of Germany's newest and best warships. He ordered his men to battle stations and set course directly for the enemy. The Admiral Hipper roared to full speed, as its radar scanned the sea ahead. Sure enough, at 9:50 a.m., the small and very, very angry silhouette of HMS Glowworm came into view through the mist. The German destroyers had hidden in a rain squall, using it to get clear and disengage, paving the way for one of history's greatest naval showdowns. Initially, the crew of Admiral Hipper hesitated to engage. In the fog, it was hard to tell who was who, and they didn't want to shoot at their friends. Their dilemma was quickly settled, however, due to the fact that HMS Glowworm, upon seeing the heavy cruiser, instead of doing the sensible things like withdrawing into the fog or signalling a recognition code, turned straight at the Germans and started bringing its torpedo launchers online. Captain Hay, though shocked and looking on in disbelief, was not rattled, and immediately ordered his ship to open fire. The heavy cruiser's guns roared into life, their first salvo sending geysers rising into the air. Glowworm pushed through the spray and surged forward, torpedoes loaded and ready. As she closed the distance, the secondary batteries on Admiral Hipper prepared to engage, but they would be left redundant as the fire control for the main guns had found the range. German 8-inch shells began tearing through the little destroyer, annihilating the bridge and the radio room while disabling the forward armament. But Captain Roop aboard Glowworm, miraculously still alive, was undeterred. He fired the torpedoes and ordered the engine room to make smoke. While Hipper was busy either dodging or sinking, they would make a break for the fog or a rain squall, whichever they could find first, and then they would break contact towards HMS Renown. Unfortunately, while their attack had been both brave and well executed, the German captain had held his nerve. Admiral Hipper, throughout the entire engagement, had been carefully manoeuvring to ensure that the bow was always pointing at Glowworm, ensuring that should torpedoes be fired at them, their effectiveness would be minimized if not evaded entirely. The heavy cruiser maintained course, dodging and weaving between the British torpedoes, eventually ploughing through the smokescreen, the secondary guns blazing away as she went, only to be met with an unthinkable sight. Glowworm had not turned to run like everyone assumed. Oh no. Captain Roop, after making smoke, realized that he had actually closed the range, and that while Hipper was evading, he could probably get his other set of torpedoes off as well. With decisive helm instructions, he ordered the ship to come about for another attack, aligning his remaining torpedo battery towards the Germans' last position, only for the Germans to unexpectedly come to him. And so here he was, an enemy heavy cruiser emerging through his own smokescreen inside his torpedo's arming distance, close enough he could probably fire his service revolver at them. His guns could hurt Hipper at this range, and most of them were still functional. In fact, he could probably get inside their main battery's range if he closed even closer. But the secondaries would tear him apart if he went broadside. In that case, there was only one thing for it. The German officers on Admiral Hipper's bridge stared in complete disbelief as the smokestack on HMS Glowworm began spewing wildly as its bow began to swing to starboard, straight at them. Ramming speed! HMS Glowworm's bow was sheared clean off in the impact, as the jagged remains of her hull gouged multiple holes in Hipper's side, wrecking her forward torpedo launchers in the process while knocking one of her crew overboard. The damage done was severe, resulting in 500 tons of water flooding multiple compartments. However, it was brought under control relatively quickly. Glowworm, meanwhile, was set afire and sinking fast. The order to abandon ship had been given once the destroyer had broken free of Hipper's hull, but the damaged vessel sank too quickly for most of her crew to escape. The icy cold waters of the North Sea flowed through the broken bow as her superstructure burned. The superheated boilers, shocked by the change in temperature, exploded with a deafening roar, taking 109 Royal Navy sailors to their deaths. The Germans, while searching for their lost man, immediately began rescue operations, pulling survivors from the water, Captain Roop being among them. But as he tried to climb aboard Admiral Hipper in the rough seas, he lost his grip on the rope and fell into the ship's wake, tragically drowning as a result. After the rescue operation was complete, Captain Hay ordered the British survivors be brought inside and warmed up as quickly as possible. He wanted to meet the men who had fought so bravely and tenaciously. Upon speaking to the prisoners, he asked after the most senior officer, who relayed the fate of Captain Roop. He told the British sailors that their captain was a very brave man, and he meant it very sincerely, Because after Admiral Hipper returned to Germany for repairs, Captain Hay filed his POW report, which always included a roll call of the prisoners' names and service numbers. This was then provided to the International Red Cross, who would inform the relevant government of their serviceman's fate. When Captain Hay filed the report to the Red Cross, he enclosed a letter addressed to the British Admiralty. That letter was nothing less than a medal citation. A citation from a German officer, an enemy combatant, describing the encounter with Glowworm and recommending Captain Roop be posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions. And sure enough, the Royal Navy agreed, awarding Lieutenant Commander Gerard Broadmead Roop, captain of HMS Glowworm, the Victoria Cross for great valour above the call of duty in successfully engaging a superior force and fighting to the very end against overwhelming odds. But while first blood had gone to the Kriegsmarine, it would be none other than the crew of the mighty submarine Orzel from the great nation of Poland who would even the scoreboard. The Polish submarine Orzel has a fantastic history, so much so that after reading a quick biography of the ship while researching this video, I made a deep dive video on it. Get it? Deep dive? Cause it's a submarine? Come on, I'm hilarious. Essentially, though, the short version of that story is they escaped Poland during the German invasion, attempted to sink a battleship, got attacked by German escorts, fled to Estonia, got interned as neutrality violators, only to, by definition, commit an act of piracy, steal their boat back, engage in a running firefight with Estonian soldiers while doing it, and then snuck through the Baltic Sea past both the German and Soviet navies to Scotland, where they joined the Royal Navy. Since then, they've been refitted and are now patrolling the south of the North Sea. Try saying that while intoxicated. But after things had started going down in Scandinavia, they had moved into the mouth of the Skagerrak to have a look around. What they found was the German cargo vessel SS Rio de Janeiro, steadily making her way along the Norwegian coastline near Kristiansand. The unfortunate freighter carried the reinforcements for the assault on Bergen, scheduled to begin the next day. It would never get there. The ORP Orgel surfaced in front of the German vessel and signalled it to stop. Once this was done, the ship was ordered to surrender or be sunk in accordance with cruiser rules. The Rio de Janeiro did not respond. Naturally, they couldn't surrender with an invasion force on board, but nor could they really run away, they're in an overloaded freighter. However, as the Germans would steadily discover throughout the course of the entire war, the Polish have a distinct deficiency of chill, nor do they have a lot of patience or sympathy for invaders. The silence from the freighter was considered a refusal of terms, and so torpedoes were promptly dispatched their way, the second volley of which detonating the ammunition stored aboard in a massive explosion, clearly heard by Norwegian villagers on shore. The Polish submarine transmitted a contact report to the Admiralty, only to follow it with a message marked as critical, as while they observed the sinking, they witnessed large numbers of personnel in what appeared to be army uniforms abandoning ship. It appeared that the jig was indeed up. Yet astonishingly, after fishing them out of the water and interrogating them, the Norwegians, despite having caught the Germans red-handed and observing the naval movements taking place, didn't put their military on high readiness. They simply ordered all their units to stand by. Thankfully, their frontline troops showed far more initiative. As midnight ticked over and the next day began, a menacing shape advanced through the midnight darkness of Oslo Fjord. Battle Group 5, en route to the Norwegian capital, was led by the heavy cruiser Blucher, sister ship of Admiral Hipper, being followed closely by the pocket battleship Lutzow. They had advanced relatively far unchallenged, but their luck was about to run out. The Norwegian patrol boat, Pole 3, was a requisitioned whaling boat, armed with a 76mm cannon and assorted small arms for the crew. A crew numbering maybe 10 to 15 men, mostly conscripts, and a hull displacement of just 214 tons. Commanded by Captain Leif Welding Olsen. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong photograph. Here we go. Captain Olsen and his crew of rather cold Vikings were, funnily enough for a patrol boat, patrolling the Oslo Fjord, when all of a sudden, the dark shape of a warship emerged from the gloom, joined by several more of worryingly ever-increasing size. The warship in question was the German destroyer escort Albatross, following Blücher down the fjord. Upon sighting the ship, Captain Olsen immediately changed course towards it, signalling an order to leave Norwegian waters immediately. When it became evident they wouldn't leave, he increased speed and fired a warning shot, stating that if they do not withdraw, he would make them. The Germans didn't respond for several minutes in sheer disbelief. Was this guy serious? He's in a barge, he's in a whaling tug, look at him, he's tiny. Eventually though, Albatross's captain, Siegfried Strelo, countered this threat with an obvious demand of his own. Surrender. But, unlike the Germans, it didn't take even a moment for Captain Olsen to reply. Less than a minute after the German ship had sent their demand, flares shot up from the Norwegian vessel, 2 red and 1 white, the signal for enemy attack, accompanied by a radio transmission warning naval headquarters and the capital's coastal fortifications that Norway was under attack. With this done, there was only one thing left to do, and for the second time within 24 hours, German sailors watched on in complete amazement as a ship less than a tenth of their tonnage made smoke and headed straight at them. Albatross's captain, realizing the vessel was armed, ordered his AA guns to fire, but it was already too late. Pole 3 slammed into the side of her prey at full speed, breaching the hull. But as a quick piece of mental arithmetic should tell you, a converted whaler is not a destroyer. Albatross shook off the attack and tore the belligerent boat to shreds, forcing the crew to abandon ship. Sadly, Captain Olsen was fatally wounded in the exchange and passed out from blood loss while abandoning ship, leading to his drowning. He would be the first Norwegian casualty of the Second World War. But his sacrifice was far from in vain. As the flares soared into the night sky, the coastal batteries came online all throughout the fjord, who began engaging the German ships through the fog. And it's here our second and third Norwegian GIGA-CHADS step into the ring. That's 3 within as many paragraphs. A testament to the tens of thousands of Norwegians who took up arms against fascism. And they were going to open their account with the Nazis in truly epic style. At 4 a.m. on April 9th, 1940, Colonel Birger Eriksen was observing the heavy cruiser Blücher getting ever closer to his position at Oscarsborg Fortress. He had been alerted by Pole 3's heroics at the mouth of the fjord, and brought what few men he had to battle stations. They were an eclectic band of National Service conscripts and aging reservists, with their numbers augmented by everything from the admin staff to the cooks from the kitchen. And this band of untrained coastal gunners were manning 40-year-old equipment no one really expected to need in open-topped fortifications. The force facing them down, meanwhile, was comprised of some of the world's most modern warships, full of elite assault troops, with the sole goal of seizing their capital along with the Norwegian royal family. The only advantage the Norwegians had is that Blücher's crew was just as shiny and new as their ship. Even so, as the Germans closed the range, it seemed as though they would succeed in their mission. But Birger Eriksen had other ideas. After gauging the range, he ordered his gunners to enter a firing solution. He had taken extra care in doing this step because, given the lack of trained personnel, once his 2 11-inch guns had been fired, he wouldn't be able to reload them. As the barrels locked into position, he checked his watch, reconfirmed his solution, took a deep breath, and gave the order to fire on Blücher. But the guns did not fire. They remained silent. His gun crews were looking at him with anxiety. The standing orders were clear. Warning shots were to be fired, followed by positive identification of who they were shooting at. His second-in-command reminded him that they would be violating this very strict protocol, and that they could end up firing on Royal Navy ships by mistake. This would create an even bigger international incident than one they were already seemingly starting. Eriksen cut him off mid-sentence with a retort that has since gone down in Norwegian legend. Either I'll be decorated or court-martialed. Now fire! The first blast shattered the early morning calm, as the 11-inch shell left its barrel and slammed into Blücher's mainmast. This knocked out the ship's radar and radio communications, while sending shrapnel raining down on the deck. The real damage, though, came from the second shot. which scored a direct hit on the munitions magazine for the Arado 196 float planes, which included an entire complement of depth charges. The explosion was catastrophic, setting the entire superstructure ablaze while blowing a hole in the side of the ship, rupturing bulkheads and sending several tons of burning oil spewing into the fjord, choking the crews in the engineering section with acrid black smoke in the process. Worse still, the explosion completely obliterated the electrical system for the main armament, meaning Blücher was unable to return fire. That said, it didn't stop Blücher's AA gunners and the soldiers aboard from making the attempt. 20mm cannon and 7.92 machine gun rounds started flying at the Norwegians, who, rather sensibly given they were now unarmed, fell back into their fortifications. However, their comrades in the smaller batteries on the other side of the fjord could reload their guns, and before the shell-shocked Germans could even get themselves organised, a veritable hailstorm of 57mm shells started tearing the Blücher's superstructure to pieces, while heavier 6-inch guns firing at close range targeted the steering and propulsion section. It was absolute chaos on board the heavy cruiser, as a raging inferno had begun storming through the ship compartment by compartment. The fire suppression system had been knocked out by the shelling. The untrained crew were descending into panic. The soldiers on board were already donning their life jackets and sprinting to get above deck. Yet Captain Oskar Kummetz kept his cool. The situation was dire, yes, but they had managed to keep their engines running, and while they'd lost their rudder, with alternate propulsion, they could control the ship enough to navigate the fjord. Pumps were keeping the water out for now, and they were getting outside the firing arc of the Norwegian guns. Lutzow, the pocket battleship behind them, could suppress the enemy with their full-size armament, so the mission, while off to a bad start, was still possible. Until the arrival of our third Norwegian GIGA-CHAD. Commander Senior Grade Andreas Andersen! He lived in the town of Drobak near the fortress, and he knew every inch of both the batteries and the fjord. He had been the commander of the base's torpedo launchers from their installation before World War I until his retirement in 1927. However, since the tensions in Europe had broken out into war, he had put himself on active reserve. That night, as the alarm was sounded, Andersen was at home getting through the last stage of a nasty case of influenza. It was then his phone rang. Colonel Eriksson told him about the approaching armada and requested he come out of retirement and man the torpedoes. He didn't even need to ask. It only took the phone to ring before Commander Andersen started pulling his old uniform jacket on. The old man was back, and he was going to kick some ass. Having hopped aboard a fishing boat across the water to his position, Andersen was now staring down the sights of his torpedo battery, looking straight at the furiously burning heavy cruiser. He was cool, but concerned. The weapons he had on hand were none other than old Whitehead torpedoes, built by, of all places, Austria-Hungary, a country that no longer existed, half of whose descendants were now sailing down his fjord to take his city. There is a touch of delicious irony in a retiree pensioner using the weapons of his youth against one of the world's newest warships. But a retiree though he be, obsolete he most certainly was not. With the experience of nearly half a century, he lined up his shot and fired a torpedo directly at Blücher. Incredibly, the ancient weapon worked perfectly and headed straight to the target, impacting just under the forward turret on the armor belt. He'd misjudged the speed slightly, thinking she still had enough power to move. Shifting his aim slightly, he fired the second, which struck Blücher directly amidships, right underneath the raging inferno consuming the upper decks. The bulkheads holding the hull together buckled and gave way, sending an icy Nordic torrent pouring into the machinery spaces as oil came pouring out. The engine stopped dead as the ship lurched over, and just like that, the second ship of the Admiral Hipper class had met its fate. The mighty warship Blücher was doomed. With no firefighting systems or engine power for the pumps, the flames advanced at will with nothing to stop them, right up until it hit the munition storage for the anti-aircraft guns. A secondary explosion nearly split the ship in two, killing hundreds of men trying to abandon ship, while rupturing the fuel bunkers, spewing yet more slimy oil into the field. Their flagship gone, assuming their commander dead, the pocket battleship Lutzow ordered the retreat, firing its guns to cover their escape. But the Norwegians would, of course, have the last word. Seeing the Germans turn tail, the shore batteries shifted their fire to Lutzow, causing serious damage to the superstructure and knocking out their forward main turret. The survivors of Blucher who made it ashore were immediately taken prisoner and put under light guard. There was no reason to corral or interrogate a group of freezing, unarmed men. All in all, between 700 to 900 German personnel were killed or wounded, with a further 1,000 or so taken prisoner, all while successfully defending the capital Oslo. And what were the total Norwegian losses? 0. Except for Captain Olsen at the initiation of hostilities, not a single Norwegian serviceman was lost. Captain Eriksen was indeed proven correct. He would be decorated, with Norway's highest award for gallantry. Operation Weserübung's main objective, and the Kriegsmarine's grand prize, had met with complete disaster. And so the capture of Oslo would fall to the initiative of Germany's youngest and most daring branch. It was time to send in the Luftwaffe. Or at least it was supposed to be. Just like the Kriegsmarine, things had started well, but as the old saying goes, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And despite what people think, the main enemy of an airman isn't the opposing force, it's the environment. Be it gravity, or in this case, the weather. The sole panzer unit involved, along with a detachment of paratroopers, had, with the aid of a shower force from a bomber wing, convinced King Christian of Denmark to capitulate with minimal resistance. The entire country of Denmark fell within hours, to the extent that Luftwaffe aircraft landed in various Danish airports to accept surrenders, including the city of Aalborg, which surrendered to Oberleutnant Victor Mulders, brother of Werner Mulders, head of Luftwaffe fighters. However, King Christian's younger brother, King Haakon of Norway, would not be so malleable to German threats. Though in fairness, King Christian didn't have two neutral countries and an ocean to get in the way of said panzers. The rest of the Luftwaffe had taken off from northern Germany, bound for Norway, but the same morning fog that had caused issues for the Navy had now turned into a thick cloud bank and rain squalls all over the place. There wasn't a way around the weather, and given their ordnance loads, climbing over it wasn't an option either. Not to mention the paratroopers were in unpressurized cabins on transports, along with a full-scale airlift coming in behind them, and those guys didn't even have parachutes. There was only one thing for it. They'd have to fly straight on through the weather and hope for the best. What came next was an absolute disaster. The lead flight of Ju-52s made it through the weather, heading for Sola at Stavanger. Capturing this airfield was vital to shut down the Norwegian Air Force and begin the airlift. Unfortunately, when they had formed up, one of their aircraft was missing, as was their fighter escort. The formation started to circle for stragglers, picking up whatever aircraft they could find. A squadron of Ju-88 high-speed medium bombers thundered past them. Their mission was to take out the airfield defences ahead of the landing, so at least that was still on schedule, though they too looked short of aircraft. It was then a pair of Bf-110s formed up on their wing, the pilots looking confused. A whole squadron was supposed to escort them, yet they were the only fighters to arrive. Well, the bombers had gone ahead, so Hauptmann Capito, the leader of the transports, gave the order for mission start. They just had to hope that they still had surprise. If they didn't take the airfield, the Bf-110 pilots would have to bail out over Norway with nowhere to land. However, it should be stated that Gordon Gollop, who was leading the Bf-110 squadron detailed for their escort, had abandoned the mission and diverted to Denmark after two of his flight collided, killing both crews. And situations like this happened across all the major airborne drops planned for southern Norway. Aircraft were scattered, formations broke apart, some abandoned the mission while others continued on. It was an absolute madhouse in the skies above the Skagerrak, causing the pilots to break radio silence and call out to one another for a navigation fix. And watching all this chaos unfold was General Hans Giesler. The commander of Fliegerkorps 10 was watching the situation develop with mounting horror. His men were in disarray and the element of surprise was almost certainly lost. If the operation couldn't be brought back under control, he would have to abort the entire operation, and if he waited too long, he wouldn't even be able to do that. General Giesler ordered a full recall. Mission abort. They would have to take Norway the old-fashioned way. But by then, it was too late. All he ended up doing was throwing the disorganized air fleet into complete confusion. The Luftwaffe, despite being the most modern air force in the world at the time, had inherited the nightmarish bureaucracy and the ego-driven turf wars of its founding government. The arms didn't know what the legs were doing, and God forbid they even speak to the head, which doesn't have a clue about any of it. And, while it was good for the time and Germany was a leading proponent of radio communication, 1940s radio technology was far from the high-powered digital satellite wizardry we know today. Even with a really beefy transmitter, atmospherics could play hell with it. Atmospherics, like now. And so, when the recall order was given, a third of the aircraft heard it, another third heard a garbled mess and had to guess, while the final third was on the wrong frequency and heard nothing at all. The end result being, perhaps the only recorded instance of a still airborne set of LGOPs, little groups of paratroopers. And so ad hoc formations of Bf-110s and Ju-52 transports joined up and headed to their objectives with little to no backup at all. To them, the mission was still very much a go. Soon the Norwegian coastline hoved into view. As Hauptmann Capito's flight approached Sola Stavanger, he saw the Ju-88s at work. The Bf-110s, having collected another flight of stragglers, gave a hand wave to the transports and dived for the airfield. They started strafing soft targets while the Ju-88s hit the defences. Oberleutnant von Brandes, in command of the Fallschirmjägers, had at his disposal 135 lightly armed men to take the airfield, and he had to hold it long enough for his backup to arrive, if it even arrived. And as the last Ju-88 dropped its bombs, 11 transports in perfect formation swept over the field, and for the first time in our history, it was about to start raining men. The Germans jumped low, right over the field. However, they had jumped into a disaster. Without the full wing of fighters to aid them, and the Ju-88s having already dropped their bombs, the defences were still active. AA fire flew up to meet them, along with a fusillade of small arms fire. But the guns, having rarely been used and hastily set up, overheated or jammed, allowing the Germans to reach the ground relatively unscathed. Frantically trying to service the weapons and get them back into operation, the Norwegian troops realised that a full-scale invasion was underway. Their weapons were non-functional, and special forces, supported by aircraft, had landed right on top of them. Panic started to spread. Preparations were made to retreat and withdraw. It was then our 4th Norwegian GIGA-CHAD cleared his machine gun, aligned his sights, and aimed at the main enemy landing zone, which just so happened to be in front of his bunker. Private Gallus Johansson grabbed the spade grip of his machine gun and depressed the trigger with venom, dropping several of the Fallschirmjägers before they even hit the ground. He then started raking the assembly area with fire, suppressing von Brandes' command element along with most of the force. The German method of airborne deployment relied on their heavier weapons being dropped in canisters, while the infantry dropped with grenades and pistols. This kept them light, mobile, and easier to stick the landing. The problem, of course, is the heavy-duty gear like machine guns, rifles, anti-tank weapons, all of that are dropped separately from their operators, and those canisters just so happen to be in the middle of an open, flat airfield in front of a machine gun. Sources on both sides vary widely and often conflict, but at least 10 enemy combatants were taken out of commission by Private Johansson alone, with some estimates saying he wounded at least 20 more. Inevitably, however, it didn't take long for the Germans to get organised. Several fire teams armed with grenades flanked his firing position and fragged it, while the rest of the unit retrieved their weapons and fanned out to secure the airfield, which they subsequently did, taking the rest of the garrison prisoner while paving the way for the mass airlift of troops following them in. Thankfully, though, Johansson was only wounded in this action. Eventually, he was taken prisoner after the door to his bunker was blown in with explosives. Until he and his weapon were taken out of commission, he manned his post, and he manned it well. A true hero of Norway. Nevertheless, the Germans had their foothold on the southwestern coast, and despite the chaos of the initial stages, their assault on Sola had been relatively textbook. The assault on Oslo, though, was a different story. Lieutenant Hansen, a flight leader in Zestergeschwader 76, flying their Bf-110s, had cobbled together some stragglers after the calamitous start to the mission. They had broken through a horrifically bad cloud front en route to Oslo-Fornebu Airport, only to be met head-on by 6 more Norwegian GIGA-CHADS. Arv Brathen, Dag Kron, Christian Schei, Finn Thorsager, Rolf Treden, and Per Valle. The Germans had run into none other than the one and literally only Norwegian fighter squadron, flying their Gloucester Gladiators. That's right, this band of Norwegian fighter pilots were facing down the world's best air force, equipped with nothing but obsolete British biplanes. Yet these absolute legends were undeterred. Their home was under attack, and they were going to defend it. They had been hard at work all morning, in fact, patrolling over the nearby fjords. They had seen the smoking wreck of the Blücher below them and eyed it with satisfaction. It was now, however, that they saw something even more satisfying. A large formation of enemy transport aircraft and not a single Bf-109 in sight. Diving in on the Ju-52s, it would be Rolf Treden who drew first blood, sending one of the transports down in flames, smoke billowing from its starboard engine as it spun into the ground. The Germans were paralyzed. The sudden and unexpected attack sent the escorting Bf-110s reeling as they scattered to escape the new threat. However, Lieutenant Erhard Kott had not acted fast enough. Before he could dive away and use the superior speed of his Messerschmitt, Dag Kron had flashed onto his tail, opening fire at very close range. He didn't stand a chance. The Bf-110 lurched over into a steep dive, its crew obviously killed outright by the Norwegians' attack, slamming into the ground on the Nesodden Peninsula south of Oslo. The other Gladiators split off and attacked the myriad of Luftwaffe aircraft filling the sky around them. HE-111s and Do-17s, on their way to hit targets inland, had been caught up in the air battle and were now subject to ferocious attack. Per Valle, having spotted the bombers, picked out an HE-111 and emptied his guns into it, sending the Heinkel spinning down right next to his home airfield at Fornebu. Dag Kron got his second kill, hitting the same formation, blasting the first HE-111's wingman. By now, though, the Bf-110s had gotten organised and rejoined the engagement, all guns blazing. Christian Schei and his Gladiator charged into the German fighters, spraying his guns at everything that moved. He'd done the same to the transports before, wounding a number of the troops inside. But his luck was about to run out. Helmut Lent, a Luftwaffe pilot who would eventually become a 100-kill ace and the de facto leader of Germany's night fighter force, had singled out this overly aggressive Gladiator for destruction. Lining up the shot, Lent opened fire at close range, riddling Schei's aircraft as well as his left shoulder. With his flight controls damaged and throttle unresponsive, the Norwegian aviator lined his Gladiator up to land in a nearby field. There was a tense moment when his undercarriage snagged a high-voltage cable, but by a miracle it gave way while slowing him down. The biplane skidded across the ground, churning the earth, eventually grinding to a halt, tilting up on its nose. Against the odds, he'd made it down safely. Extricating himself with difficulty and with the help of the locals, he was quickly taken to a hospital in Sandvika, west of Oslo. With the Germans now organised and ever so slightly furious at being bullied by Norwegians in biplanes, the surviving Gladiators promptly decided that it was time to leave, beating a hasty retreat to their divert fields, all except Per Valle, who, wanting to rearm as fast as possible and get back in the fight, chose to land at Fornebu, the Germans' primary target. As he taxied towards the hangars, frantic gestures from the ground crew as well as the loud reports of anti-aircraft fire warned him of the oncoming danger. Quickly turning his engine off, he unbuckled his straps and dove out of the aircraft, sprinting for a nearby slit trench. This would end up saving his life, as not a minute later, ZG-76 swept over the airfield, blasting every remaining aircraft on it. The 2 spare Gladiators, Tiger Moth trainers, a civilian transport, every aircraft on the field went up in flames on the first pass. The 110s made run after run against the airfield's defences, who frantically fired back at the offending Germans. However, being members of the capital city's garrison who had sunk a heavy warship that morning, their morale and resolve was made of much sterner stuff, and they soon started inflicting damage on their attackers. One of Lieutenant Hansen's engines took a direct hit, spewing coolant everywhere, while another 110 was torn to shreds, leaking fuel literally all over the place, which was a huge issue as due to the bad weather, the unexpected dogfight, and the heavy resistance, most of the fighters had their red fuel warning lights on. They had to land. However, it appeared that they had achieved their objective. The enemy was distracted, their defenses halved, the enemy aircraft either destroyed or forced away, and at that moment a full wing of Ju-52s arrived overhead, ready to disgorge their paratroopers and take the airfield. Only they didn't. They started forming up into a line astern formation, with the lead transport dropping his flaps and cutting his throttles. Oh shit. In the chaos of the morning, the paratrooper force had received the recall and withdraw order, meaning they'd aborted their drop, but the airlift component had either not received it or, as the evidence suggests, ignored the command as an enemy ruse. Whatever the cause, an entire wing of transport aircraft were about to land on an enemy airfield, currently manned by an entire garrison armed with anti-aircraft artillery and machine guns. Lieutenant Hansen had to think fast. He and his wingmen were out of ammo, as was Helmut Lent. Their fuel was low, and the lead transport was even now starting to touch down. He had no radio communications with the airlift forces, so he couldn't warn them off, and he didn't even have a flare signal or anything for that either. Then, it happened. The Norwegians unloaded on the landing Ju-52, tearing it to pieces along with the men inside, including Hauptmann Wagner. The other transports, seeing it happen, waved off immediately under heavy fire. However, the second in line was already on final, and he couldn't abort his landing. Lieutenant Hansen made a split-second decision, a decision which earns both he and Helmut Lent their own GIGA-CHADS award. They couldn't let their comrades get slaughtered. They had no fuel to divert to friendly territory, and without the paratroopers coming, there was no way to prevent the entire invasion from falling apart, especially after the Kriegsmarine got decimated.
What do you mean? They've only lost one ship so far.
Oh, right. We haven't got there yet. Simply put, the situation was dire. Their mission was practically a bust. Except Lieutenant Hansen and the men of ZG-76 decided, no. If the paratroopers aren't coming, I guess we'll just have to do it ourselves. The pilot of the second Ju-52 suddenly noticed all the Norwegians start to panic and shift their fire to his left. He then nearly had a heart attack as skidding across the airfield in front of him, literally missing his nose by inches, was none other than Helmut Lent's Bf-110. After skidding off the end of the runway and knocking over a farmer's fence, the rest of the Messerschmitts started emptying their remaining ammo into the Norwegians before following suit and crash landing on the airfield. Once this was done, they got out, grabbed their rear-mounted machine guns as well as their pistols, pulled them out of the aircraft, and assaulted the airfield themselves. That's right, these Luftwaffe pilots crash-landed their aircraft, pulled the guns off the back, and stormed the airfield themselves. The Oslo garrison, upon seeing this take place, quickly decided that given that they were low on ammo and the enemy was willing to pull this level of bullshit, it was time to fall back and regroup. The Norwegians withdrew from the airfield and headed north, leaving their heavy equipment and the capital city behind. But they had done their duty, and they'd done it well. They had bought time for their royal family and King Haakon VII to escape along with the government. But they weren't out of the woods yet. As the Ju-52 started unloading their troops, frantic radio calls were made to Fliegerkorps 10's headquarters, telling them that the field had been taken and reinforcements were required immediately. But the Luftwaffe Air Attaché to Norway, Hauptmann Eberhard Spiller, was not going to wait around and let the country's most valuable hostages get away. He had raced to the airfield with all possible speed after he had heard that the invasion had started, and even as the first transport unloaded its troops, he ran to meet them. After assembling the first wave of the landing forces, which included a small unit of Fallschirmjägers, a group of Luftwaffe field troops, and even a Wehrmacht marching band, he marched into Oslo to officially declare Germany's special military operation in Norway to defend its neutrality from the Western Allies, who so horribly violated it during the Altmark incident. Of course, no one would buy this nonsense. Even with Vidkun Quisling proclaiming his independent pro-Nazi government, everyone would rightfully see this as an invasion. But if they could get the king to sign off on it, as they had with Denmark, it would give them political and international legitimacy. Problem is, they need the king for that, and he is never going to do that voluntarily. So, after their little parade, Hauptmannspieler assembled the small group of Fallschirmjägers that had shown up, tactically acquired an assortment of civilian vehicles, including several buses as well as an assortment of cars, and then charged after the fleeing Norwegian government, eventually catching up to them just after midnight near the town of Elverum. But they would advance no further, as a roadblock had been set up by the withdrawing Norwegian forces that clogged the road completely for at least 100 meters or more. The German troops, having failed in clearing the obstacles with their vehicles, dismounted and advanced past the blockade towards a small farming hamlet named Midtskogen. It was then the leader of the Fallschirmjägers got suspicious. With tree lines on their flanks, buildings to their front, and a roadblock forcing them to halt, this had trap or ambush written all over it. He ordered the mortar section with them to fire illumination rounds over the hamlet. Hauptmannspieler protested at the delay, but there was no sense in taking unnecessary risks. The flares lit up the snow-covered ground around the farm buildings, revealing our 11th Norwegian GIGA-CHAD, Captain of the King's Guard, Olaf Helseth, who immediately ordered his men to open fire. At the initiation of combat, the Germans immediately went into action. MG-34s started laying down a base of fire as the paratroopers advanced. However, they had not just walked into any ambush, they had just walked into a complex ambush. A Norwegian machine gun opened up on their flank, killing 2 or 3 men in the first burst, while pinning the attackers in place. This was followed by an attempted counterattack. Unfortunately for the Norwegians, though, these weren't regular riflemen. They were elite airborne troops who, without missing a beat, shifted fire to the flanking force, throwing it back, and then they followed with a direct assault. But the Norwegian troops held strong. They kept the fight going for well over an hour, with each side both gaining and losing fire superiority several times over the course of the engagement. Eventually, though, something had to give, and in the end, it would be the invaders. A well-placed rifle round seriously wounded Hauptmannspieler, while the Norwegians executed an absolutely textbook fighting withdrawal to the north. Their quarry escaping and their commander dying, the Germans remounted their remaining vehicles and headed back to Oslo. This battle, while tiny, was truly decisive. So much so, there is a national monument to it that stands to this day, while Olaf Helseth would eventually become Norway's head of defence. The heroics of this small cadre of less than 100 Norwegians allowed their parliament to escape, form a quorum, and formally organise a wartime government, all while allowing the head of state to get to safety, boosting the morale of the nation, and beginning the process of a fight back. Yet far to the north, in an isolated but vital fjord, that fight back had already begun. After shaking off the exceptionally belligerent HMS Glowworm with the aid of Admiral Hipper, the first destroyer flotilla made it to Narvik in one piece and remarkably on time, and with the help of a secret Kriegsmarine base in the Northern Soviet Union, codenamed Base Nord, they had covertly pre-positioned civilian refueling tankers in the port, just to make sure they had a quick turnaround time. So all they had to do was drop off their invasion force, that being the Austrian 139th Regiment of Mountain Troops, or the Gebirgsjägers, refuel their ships, and then bug out back to sea in order to rejoin with the battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, who had tagged along just in case home fleet showed up. The Gebirgsjägers, meanwhile, were to seize the town of Narvik itself and then immediately move to secure the rail bridge to Sweden. After all, the entire purpose of the invasion was to secure a warm water transit route for Swedish iron ore through Norwegian ports. If they didn't take this objective, the entire plan is quite literally derailed. Eh? Come on, that one was good too. Give it to me, please. Anyway, Once they had actually seized and secured their objectives, they would dig in and then wait for airlifted reinforcements from the south, which by then should be under their control. This would quickly be followed by a mechanized force coming up from Oslo, securing the rest of the country on the way. Just as Falcon Horse envisioned, a lot of moving parts, but very simple in concept. But of course, like all military plans, it never survives first contact with the enemy, and worse still, this plan would prove that the only general more dangerous to the Germans than General Winter is Field Marshal Murphy. His law is as absolute as it is terrifying, and everything was about to go wrong. Upon approaching the mouth to the fjord, the destroyers encountered the Norwegian Navy's Narvik perimeter patrol. Just like the one in Oslo, this small force was comprised of 3 converted trawlers providing early warning. They managed to seize the 3 ships without combat, but not before one of them transmitted an attack warning to the 2 coastal defence ships guarding Narvik, a pair of clapped-out 40-year-old British gunboats. Realising they'd probably been compromised, the German destroyers fanned out quickly and deposited the first wave of Gebirgsjägers to clear out suspected coastal batteries in the fjord. There actually weren't any coastal defence batteries, but they didn't know that at the time, and as experiences down south demonstrate, it was definitely a good idea. What mattered is they had troops ashore and the initiative. Advantage Kriegsmarine, so it seemed. It was hoped they could avoid a fight like they had with the patrol craft, so a preemptive move was the wisest course. Then, out of the murky mist of the early morning, came our 12th Norwegian GIGA-CHAD, Captain Odd Isaacsen Willoch of the Norwegian ship Eidsvold, who immediately ordered the flotilla of 10 modern destroyers to turn about immediately or face the consequences. When the Germans didn't stop, he promptly fired a warning shot from the 8.3-inch main battery across the bow of the lead ship. This got their attention. The commander of the flotilla, Commodore Friedrich Bonte, following his orders to attempt a peaceful occupation, ordered his ships to halt and signalled the Norwegians that he was sending an officer to negotiate. Soon after, Korvettenkaptein Grek was standing on the bridge of the Eidsvold, asking Captain Willoch to surrender. They were hopelessly outgunned, and as they speak, Oslo was more than likely coming under occupation. Captain Willoch replied that he would need to consult his commanding officer, our 13th Norwegian GIGA-CHAD, Captain Per Askim, aboard the Norwegian ship Norge, before making any decisions. Yet as this conversation was taking place, the radio operator aboard was already relaying everything. Even as the German officer was still pleading his case, orders came back almost immediately. Open fire. After reading the message slip handed to him, Willoch nodded his assent to the radio operator, turned to Kaptein Grek, and politely but firmly refused. If they wanted a country that surrenders, they'd have to look elsewhere. As the now enemy officer returned to his ship, Captain Willoch ordered a red flare be fired to signal the start of hostilities. He then turned and roared at the top of his voice, "All ahead full and man the guns! We're gonna fight, boys!" Eidsvold's engines roared to life as the bow swung towards the Kriegsmarine flagship, Z-21 Wilhelm Heidknapp, closing on the Germans to within 300 meters. However, Commodore Bonte had been expecting this since the negotiations had dragged on with no sign of capitulation. 4 torpedoes slammed into the Eidsvold before they could even fire a shot in anger, detonating the magazine and splitting the valiant ship in half. Only 8 of her crew would survive to be rescued. The rest, including her captain, gave their lives for Norway in the hope that they had bought their comrades some time. And they had. Norge was at battle stations and began engaging the oncoming invaders, while the local garrison was scrambling to get organised. A mixed bag of regular soldiers and reservists grabbed their kit and got organised to resist, only to be greeted by German troops already entering the town. Thinking fast, the officer in charge, our 14th Norwegian GIGA-CHAD, Major Sigurd Omdal, led his band of approximately 250 men out of the town. He was even stopped by the Germans on the way, only to bluff his way past. He knew what they were here for, and he made his way to the bridge into Sweden as fast as his men could march. There were emergency demolition charges rigged to it. As long as he got there first, they'd be able to deny the enemy their prize. Meanwhile, back in port, Norge put up a brave but hopeless resistance. They managed to buy time for a pair of submarines to escape, but not much else. The German destroyers didn't even take the threat seriously, pulling in to unload their troops before firing. They dismantled the coastal defense ship with a well-placed volley of torpedoes without taking any damage in return. Thankfully, though, there was no secondary detonation. Of the 191-man crew, 90 were rescued, including the captain. By 9 AM, the Germans held the town, taking the majority of the garrison prisoner before they could get organized. Major Omdahl's men were the only exception. The commander of ground troops, General Eduard Dietl, was pleased with his men's efforts. Now he could get to work unloading the pre-positioned cargo vessels while the Navy refuels. He had sent an element to secure the bridge when he landed, so everything seemed to be going according to plan. When he got to the quay, however, both he and Commodore Bonte were in for a shock. Several of their transports and one of their crucial fuel tankers were missing. A good amount of their provisions and heavy equipment was just gone. Unbeknownst to either commander, they had run afoul of the Royal Navy and the Norwegian ship Nordnapp. The German sailors having haplessly blundered into Operation Wilfred and some now very angry Nords. This was a disaster. They only had one oiler to fuel all 10 of their destroyers, and it wasn't even a dedicated replenishment vessel. It was, like a lot of Kriegsmarine shipping, a converted civilian freighter. It would take them over 24 hours to do. And then it got worse. Reports came back from the force sent to take the rail bridge that Major Omdahl and his men had fought the Gebirgsjägers to a standstill, successfully blowing the bridge after evacuating a considerable number of refugees into Sweden, while another unit of Norwegians had mobilized in time to defend Narvik's nearest airfield, forcing the Germans back. Their primary objective had just gone up in smoke, while suffering casualties his now isolated and beleaguered force could ill afford. Meanwhile, Commodore Bonte was now getting terrifying updates from the rest of Naval Group 1. Battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had started transmitting contact reports, and they had run into none other than the battlecruiser HMS Renown and her task force, who were now demonstrating Royal Navy gunnery firsthand, crippling Gneisenau's fire control system with a direct hit. The Germans knew that this could only mean one thing. If there was a British capital ship hanging around, there was bound to be more, and it was now time to f***ing leave. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau made smoke and ran for it, while the destroyers in Narvik frantically started refueling. But that would take time, and it was becoming rapidly apparent to everyone that time was the one thing they just didn't have. In the deep, dingy basement of Admiralty House in London, the senior leaders of the Royal Navy had now started to piece together the situation. Hitler hadn't missed the bus, he was in fact driving it, and they needed to act fast. The ships assigned to Operation Wilfred were now tasked to seek and destroy all German shipping in Norwegian waters to prevent further landings, as well as to distract the Allied public from yet another unfolding disaster. One of the biggest knock-on effects, as implied by my reference to his quote, was the political position of Neville Chamberlain. After the Munich Agreement's failure to prevent the war, and now this whole Scandinavian shitshow, his ability to lead was not just questioned, it was outright rejected, with one senior MP heckling him in the House of Commons, "For God's sake, just go." Nevertheless, something had to be salvaged from this situation, and so the men originally stood down from Operation R4 were hastily recalled and re-equipped, while Royal Navy fleet units scrambled en masse with orders to be as aggressive as practically possible. It would take a while for them to arrive though, so for now, it was down to the ships already on the scene to respond. The closest ones to the area being the 2nd Destroyer Flotilla, under the command of our 2nd British GIGA-CHAD, Captain Bernard Armitage Warburton Lee. Now he gets Chad points for the name alone, obviously, but it would be his actions on April 10th that would put him into the history books. He had received word from the Admiralty that a single German warship had taken Narvik, while he'd also heard that Renown engaged Scharnhorst and Gneisenau nearby. The situation was very confused. No one had any idea what was happening, beyond the fact that Norway was half occupied, and defecation had collided with oscillation in a most spectacular fashion. This wasn't enough to make plans around. Hell, it wasn't even enough to improvise around. There was no way the Germans took a defended port with just one ship. Even the dreaded battleship Bismarck they'd been hearing all those rumours about couldn't carry enough Marines to defeat the town's garrison, which obviously means the Germans have more than one ship. But just how many more? They had to find out, of course. But they didn't have any recon aircraft available, and even if they did, the weather was absolutely god-awful. There was a snowstorm brewing in the area overnight, so there was really only one thing for it. They had to go ask the locals. And so the British anchored off the coast in the middle of the night to drop off a shore party who promptly went to a nearby town on the mouth of Narvik's fjord and asked what was going on. And I am sure you can see the problem. None of them could speak any Norwegian, and the Norwegians couldn't speak English. But not to worry. After some awkward pointing, sign language, and a few English-Scandinavian loanwords, they eventually worked out that at least 6 German destroyers were anchored in Narvik harbour, alongside cargo ships full of supplies for the Wehrmacht, who had seized the town and the local rail net. Now, Captain Warburton Lee only had 5 H-class destroyers: Hardy, Hotspur, Havoc, Hunter, and Hostile. Man, British ship names are so cool. All we do in Australia and the United States is name them after people or places and battles occasionally. But yes, he was outnumbered by the force in Narvik, and the 2 biggest and baddest German battleships in service were lurking somewhere nearby. The logical choice would be to rejoin with the heavy fleet units and get ready for a decisive battle. But Captain Warburton Lee didn't want a decisive battle, because he was a decisive man. The enemy is in port. They've been on constant duty for at least 48 hours, and with their battleships out front, they probably feel really secure. Calling his men to battle stations, the 2nd Destroyer Flotilla of the Royal Navy formed up and entered Narvik's fjord under the cover of a snowstorm. They would attack at dawn. The visibility was appalling, so much so that the British ships broke radio silence to accurately navigate through the rocky and craggy coastline of the fjord. However, the German sailors who were on duty were in their refueling evolution, while most of them were asleep, including Commodore Bonte himself. Because they were so undermanned, no one was listening in on known Royal Navy frequencies, as was normal standard procedure. The zero visibility conditions obscured the vision of the U-boats, who were supposed to be the outer picket providing security. In fact, it was bad enough that the German destroyer guarding the main channel of the fjord had returned to refuel, as maintaining their post was essentially pointless, as no one would be insane enough or stupid enough to launch an attack in these conditions. Oh, how wrong they were. As the sun broke the horizon, the British saw the reported 6 German destroyers tied alongside the pier, along with their cargo vessels being slowly and methodically unloaded. Refueling operations were still proceeding at pace, and the German lookouts were scanning the area, but mainly, they were just trying to stay warm. It was then they saw the shadowy shapes of warships coming out of the gloom, and on closer inspection, they definitely weren't Kriegsmarine types. The lead ship, in fact, looked a lot closer than the others, and it seemed to be raising a battle ensign. Oh, shite. Before the alarm could be raised, the flagship, Wilhelm Heidkamp, was rocked by a torpedo hit from HMS Hardy, starting a fire which ignited the aft ammunition magazine. The subsequent explosion blew the rear of the ship completely off, killing Commodore Bonte along with half of the crew. The German flotilla had been decapitated in the opening salvo, and chaos reigned in the harbour. Everyone thought it was an air raid at first, but HMS Hunter would quickly set the record straight on that score. 4.7-inch shells started raining down on the ships at anchor as more silvery torpedo wakes stormed towards the German destroyer Z-22 Anton Schmidt. An explosion near the bow rocked the ship as icy cold Norwegian waters rushed in. But their problems were only just beginning, as our 3rd British GIGA-CHAD enters the fray. Lieutenant Commander Rafe E. Courage. Yes, really. Captain Rafe E. Courage, captain of HMS Havoc, and Havoc was the perfect name. Torpedoes and main gun rounds went flying at almost every single ship in the harbour. One of the torpedoes struck Z-22 directly amidships, splitting the destroyer in half, while causing such a catastrophic explosion, the shockwave knocked out the engines and electrical systems of destroyer Z-17 anchored nearby. Narvik harbour was now a maelstrom of burning infernos and sinking ships. The Germans' cargo vessels were all shattered and sinking by their peers, with the only exception being, ironically, their fuel tanker, probably due to the fact it was parked near the destroyers, and those ships can shoot back, making them a far more pressing target. And speaking of shooting back, now the Kriegsmarine were awake, and an almighty gunfight at close range broke out. Ships on both sides started taking serious damage. Z-17, unable to move, was forced to act as a floating gun battery. She ended up taking an absolute pummeling from HMS Hostile, so much so that the resulting fires forced the crew to evacuate to the pier and fight the fires from on shore. But Hostile didn't escape unscathed herself. She took hits from the other German destroyers who had started getting underway. Captain Warburton Lee, seeing that his attack had been a success, ordered his ships to pull back into the fjord to regroup. He had evened the odds by hitting first, and now it was time to settle this with a stand-up fight, something the Royal Navy had proven to be very good at. But he had been operating on faulty intelligence, for we know that the German destroyer flotilla that took Narvik wasn't 6 ships, but 10. The other German ships had been dispersed throughout the different inlets in the fjord to guard against air attack, all while freeing up as much pier space as possible for unloading and reprovisioning, and the British had sailed right past them. As the weather started to clear, dawn turned into day, revealing the unseen and undamaged Kriegsmarine vessels at full combat readiness, steaming at full speed to cut off their escape. It was time to leave, and they would have to fight their way out. With orders to make smoke, the British formed a battle column and charged down the German ships, who at that moment were crossing the T in front of them. Realizing their escape route was now blocked, Captain Warburton Lee transmitted a message to all ships: keep engaging the enemy. It would be his last act as a commander, and his last act on Earth. The Germans were in a much better position with a fresh crew. A full broadside from Z2 Georg Thiel smashed into HMS Hardy's bridge, killing the command team as well as the bridge officers of the ship. Only one of the officers survived. Of all people, it was the paymaster, Lieutenant Geoffrey Stanning, whose first instinct was to ram Z2 in retaliation. But the constant fusillade of fire had knocked out their weapons and damaged the ship to such an extent it wouldn't be practical. Heavily wounded, with his remaining strength, he conned the ship onto the shore of the fjord and successfully beached it, saving the lives of the remaining crew on board. Definitely a mad lad. Meanwhile, HMS Hotspur was burning fiercely, and HMS Hunter had taken serious torpedo damage. They had managed to force their way past the Germans, but at serious cost to themselves. The situation was looking dire. It was then that Captain Rafe Courage once again began living up to his name by covering the escape of the surviving ships, by making a smokescreen, and then charging down the now pursuing Kriegsmarine, all guns blazing. Sadly, they couldn't save HMS Hunter, but the heroics of HMS Havoc and her captain scared the Germans off, allowing everyone else to escape. And the final cherry on top of this operation? You know the massive cargo ship bringing the next batch of crucial supplies to the Gebirgsjägers in Narvik? That cargo ship ran headlong into the British as they were leaving, quickly being dispatched by HMS Havoc's guns. As the fires were put out and the dust settled, 2 German destroyers were sunk, 7 supply ships were sunk, 4 other destroyers were heavily damaged, one of which being beyond repair, while the commodore of the entire naval operation was blown into itty-bitty pieces. The British, meanwhile, had lost 2 destroyers, suffered heavy damage to a third, and lost their captain. However, he would go down in history not just for this event, but for the very first Victoria Cross awarded in the Second World War. Back on shore, General Dietl was now faced with a terrible situation. His supplies were gone, the rail line he was sent all the way up here to get had been blown up, a third of his naval force was gone, and he was getting word from headquarters that the bad weather, combined with much heavier losses than originally expected, would prevent the Luftwaffe from sending him back up anytime soon. Not that he had an airfield for them to land at. Worse still, the Norwegians who had blown up the bridge had linked up with the force defending the airfield, as well as still more Norwegian troops who have answered the call for mobilization. They were even now getting themselves organized to retake Narvik from the invaders. He had to get help. Getting the Luftwaffe back on the line, he demanded they send help. There was a frozen lake nearby they could try and land on. They didn't even need reinforcements, what they needed was supplies. Realizing just how bad the situation was for the stranded Gebirgsjägers, frantic efforts were made to retrofit a squadron of Ju-52s with extra long-range fuel tanks. But that would take at least 24 to 48 hours, so it wouldn't be until the 13th of April that flights could come out. The Germans spent the 12th of April licking their wounds and counting the dead. A British recon aircraft from the Fleet Air Arm flew over taking a look at the aftermath of the previous day's battle, but no bombs fell. However, that aircraft only had one engine, meaning it was a carrier aircraft. This was a rather ominous sign. Though as the sun rose over Narvik Fjord on April 13th, news came down from Fliegerkorps 10 that the modifications to the transports had been completed and that the Luftwaffe was on the way. Furthermore, the Wehrmacht had gotten some of its heavier gear ashore down south and were at that very moment marching north to relieve them. It would take a lot of time marching across the hinterland of mountainous Norway, yet help was coming. But not soon enough. As the Gebirgsjägers started getting organized to receive their resupply, the Kriegsmarine was still struggling to get their refueling done while patching the damage done by Warburton, Lee and his men. It was then, softly in the distance, though steadily getting louder, they heard music, as though it was passing through the fabric of time itself, similar to the rumbling trumpet phenomena you occasionally hear near low-pressure weather systems. Only this was distinctly music. It was then a dark, shadowy shape loomed up the fjord, escorted by an entire fleet of destroyers and a squadron of aircraft. The large, shadowy figure began signaling. The signal read, "I'm not locked in here with you. You're locked in here with me." HMS Warspite, the grand old lady, queen of the seas, had entered the fjord undaunted. Such close-in and narrow waters were thought to be too dangerous for a force of this size, but the men of the Royal Navy never back away from a challenge in seamanship, as we've established. Captain Bay, leader of the German flotilla, ordered his ships to push up and engage the enemy in open waters, only to suddenly realize that Warspite was coming to meet them. In a twist of amusing irony, the words of Admiral Farragut were most appropriate. Damn the torpedoes! Full speed ahead. She had even launched her Walrus seaplane, which then went and immediately sank one of the U-boats standing guard to prevent just this sort of situation, marking the first submarine sunk by aircraft in World War II. The other U-boat couldn't get into position to shoot because Warspite had taken the only part of the fjord deep enough for them to safely attack. The gunners aboard the Grand Old Lady immediately went to work. Within minutes, her 15-inch guns began murdering German destroyers. It was only by a miracle that they managed to hang in the fight. Near misses inflicting shock damage while raining shrapnel and shell fragments across their decks. The British destroyers began flinging torpedoes at anything still floating, while HMS Furious's air wing flew in overhead, dropping bombs and strafing. The German commander, out of ammo, out of fuel, and cornered by the angriest ship in the Royal Navy, made the toughest choice a fleet commander can make. He ordered his vessels to be beached or scuttled. And with that order, Destroyer Group 1 met its end. The German sailors began detonating their scuttling charges or ramming their ships ashore. Once they were certain that their ship was out of action, they abandoned ship. Meanwhile, with their work handily done, the Royal Navy withdrew in good order, without having lost a single ship and only suffering minor shell damage. Their only significant losses were 2 aircraft shot down during the engagement. As the victorious British sailed away, Captain Crutchley, our 4th British GIGA-CHAD, and Captain of Warspite, was heard to remark, It was just like shelling peas. General Dietl quickly went down to the port and organised the now shipless sailors into naval infantry units, sending them down to the frozen lake in preparation to unload their resupply aircraft. At this point, he was probably thinking it just couldn't get any worse. But as we know, it most definitely could. His airlift arrived. Only one of our heroes from earlier, unfortunately I couldn't find out which one, had intercepted the flight in his Gladiator, shooting one of them down. 3 more transports crashed on landing, while the rest froze into the ice while they were being unloaded. And it was at that precise moment the Norwegians, who had gotten reorganized, chose to counterattack in force and seize the lake back, taking half the supplies as well as capturing and subsequently destroying all their aircraft. It was now at about this point, with all these calamities stacking up on one another, that General Hans Giesler and General von Falkenhorst decided that they would need to take drastic action. The Fallschirmjäger units down south, their mission complete, had reorganized, and in an effort to speed up their advance from Oslo and link up all their forces, they were dropped in the area of Donbass. No, not that one, this one. A crucial rail junction between Oslo and Trondheim. However, like in a mini Operation Market Garden, the weather was so bad half of them crashed, the other half got scattered to hell when they did drop, and they dropped in the wrong place, straight into an entire division of Norwegians assembling to repel the invaders. They were immediately surrounded and attacked relentlessly. Eventually, they would be forced to surrender, representing a major victory for the Norwegian forces and a huge blow to the Germans, who didn't have that many assets to begin with. Narvik would have to wait until the weather cleared and more German forces managed to advance far enough north so that they could airlift men in. But that could very well take weeks. And wait a minute, do you guys hear bagpipes? Throughout the latter half of April and into early May, the Allied Northern Expeditionary Force landed throughout the region around Narvik, linking up with the Norwegians. The Scots, Irish and Welsh were backed up by the French Foreign Legion and mountain troops from both Poland and France. And get this, the French even brought tanks. But sadly, as the Allies were getting organised to start going on the offensive, Hitler made his move. On May 10th, 1940, the Germans began Case Yellow, their invasion of France and the Low Countries. Luftwaffe airstrikes and airborne assaults, many of which being led by the men who took Fornebu and Sola, crushed both Belgium and Holland within days, while Rommel and Guderian began tearing through the Ardennes into the Allied rear, cutting off their best troops. The entire campaign was a fait accompli. The forces deployed to Norway represented some of the best units Britain and France had. Meanwhile, their naval assets would soon be needed to cover the planned evacuation from Dunkirk, as well as provide fleet units for the Mediterranean, as Italy seemed to be making moves to join the war. The Allies finally retook Narvik on May 27, 1940, only to turn around to the Norwegians and tell them it was so they could use it as an evacuation port. After all their heroics, after all that sacrifice, and the victories they had won over the Nazis, Norway was to be abandoned to its fate. As British and French soldiers fought for their lives trying to escape from Dunkirk, German panzers closing in on them while Stukas screamed overhead, their comrades 2,000 miles to the north were doing exactly the same thing, coming under air attack from approaching German forces. It was then that disaster struck. Realizing the British were on the run, the Kriegsmarine sortied Scharnhorst and Gneisenau to make a hit-and-run attack on the evacuation fleet, only to run into the aircraft carrier HMS Glorious, out of position with only a small destroyer screen for defense. The German battleships, realizing the opportunity, advanced and tore her to pieces. But in keeping with the aggression seen in Allied destroyer captains, HMS Ardent closed with the 2 offending capital ships and peppered them with 5-inch fire and torpedoes, inflicting considerable but not fatal damage. With home fleet almost certainly bearing down on them at max speed to get vengeance and needing to repair their battle damage, the Germans, having sunk an aircraft carrier, decided that this was a prize worth taking and leaving. Both Scharnhorst and Gneisenau would end up terrorizing British merchant traffic during the upcoming Battle of the Atlantic. But for now, they'd done their part and needed a refit. The Norwegian government boarded HMS Devonshire at Narvik to go into exile, and by June 10th, orders were transmitted to all surviving Norwegian army units to lay down their arms. And thus, our epic story has come to an end. But although this campaign is very rarely mentioned, its effects would have immense consequences. Neville Chamberlain, having suffered a major embarrassment at being beaten to Scandinavia by Hitler, was forced to resign his post, being replaced by Winston Churchill. And in holding out from April 9th to June 10th, Norway was the most fiercely defiant nation of all the Allied powers. She had held out longer than any other Allied nation against German invasion. The bravery of her soldiers, sailors and airmen inflicted irreplaceable losses on the Kriegsmarine as well as the elite German infantry corps. And even as the order to surrender went out, half the Norwegian soldiers who survived the campaign immediately began organising the resistance or joining Norwegian units in exile. It would be a group of these men who would form a special forces detachment to take out the Norsk heavy water plant, vital to Nazi atomic weapons research, while Norwegian aviators would form entire squadrons in the RAF, never tiring in their efforts to liberate their homeland. Intelligence from these pilots and their countrymen in the resistance was vital to the security of the Arctic Lend-Lease convoys, which saved the Eastern Front from a logistical and operational disaster, and it also directly led to the RAF's eventual destruction of battleship Tirpitz. Norway, as I said, is a forgotten campaign, yet I hope I have done my part to remedy that. But if there is one takeaway from this story, let it simply be this. No matter how dire it may seem, no matter how hopeless the situation is, when confronted with a fascist invader demanding your surrender, there is only one appropriate response. Fascist warship? Go f*** yourself.